Okay, I think I'll get started here for those who are here. Hello to everyone. Welcome to the 8th session of the 2021-2022 Learning Exchange Series. I'm your host today, Kylie Clay, the Associate Director for the Forest, Carbon, and Climate Program at Michigan State. We're very pleased to lead the Learning Exchange Series in partnership with the Forest Climate Working Group. The Forest Climate Working Group is a diverse group of forest interests with over 60 members, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. A large diversity of folks there. The group has worked together for more than a decade to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. So you now see on the screen the full year's lineup of speakers. We'll drop a link to the webpage, to the FCCP webpage in just a minute in the chat, so you can check out all the speakers in more detail, as well as any previous recordings from this year and from previous years from webinars. So this year, we have 3 major thematic bins. One, voluntary carbon markets. The second is changing landscapes of climate and forests. And this third bin is emerging science. So again, on our ORL, which I'll put the link into, you can watch recordings for any of those previous webinars that have already taken place. For today's presentation, I'd like to introduce both Kendall DeLyser, Director of Climate Science at American Forest, and our very own Chad Papa, a PhD candidate in the Department of Forestry at Michigan State and a research assistant with the FCCP. Their presentation today is called Modeling Forest Management and Carbon, a tool for statewide planning and action. Today's session is the second presentation falling under the third category of emerging science and information. So we're very happy to have these speakers today and are really excited to get a closer look at all this state level forest carbon modeling they've all been up to, of great interest to all of us, I'm sure. And I'm of course unbiased in that. So we're excited to begin, but before we do, I'd like to briefly share a few details. First, many of you have heard this before, I'm sure, but first to automatically receive registration details, if you're not already, and information regarding upcoming webinars, please email forestc@msu.edu to join our mailing list. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the web alongside any supplemental resources like the slides from today's presentation in the next week or so. So if you've registered for this presentation, you'll receive an email letting you know when and where to find those supplemental materials. This session will be followed today by a Q&A. So in the bottom of the Zoom interface, you'll see both chat and Q&A. Within each, you can ask questions at any point during the presentations. So if you're calling in on the phone, but can email, you can also send questions directly to ForestC, again, at msu.edu, forestc@msu.edu. So we'll compile all the questions throughout the presentation and pose them to our speakers in the Q&A session at the end, time permitting. All right, next we have continuing education credits. Attendees today are qualified to receive 1 CFE credit from SAF. This will be automatically communicated to SAF and you'll receive credit if you've registered with your information on your SAF account. If you have any questions about this, please reach out to us at, again, forestc@msu.edu. And that's all I have for this background bits here. But with that, Kendall and Chad, will you please take over the screen and begin today's presentation?
Thank you, Kylie, for the introduction. So as Kylie said, our presentation today is titled Modeling Forest Management and Carbon, a tool for statewide planning and action. So a brief overview of our presentation today, if we go to the next slide. So we're gonna have an introduction about just generally forest carbon modeling, what that means. Specifically the modeling approach that we have taken, as well as discussing how we integrate various disparate data sets into the CBM CFS3 modeling framework, followed by discussing some results that we have, looking at forest management and wood utilization and the impact on carbon dynamics and how that relates to statewide planning and action. So if we go to the next slide, Forests play an important role on global carbon cycling, as well as providing other ecosystem services such as climate regulation. And understanding forest dynamics and trends in carbon across scales is very important to gain insights, not just into global climate change, but as well as learning more about our natural ecosystems. And so when we say we're modeling forest carbon, what exactly do we mean? So modeling is inherently scale dependent. So if we can think about models, we can build models to understand carbon dynamics at the leaf level, the tree level, as well as the stand, up to the regional landscape level, as well as global levels. And characterizing these heterogeneous systems can be quite difficult, but over time, we've taken detailed forest measurements and developed, validated, and calibrated a variety of models to understand carbon dynamics. And with a specific focus on today's talk, kind of at the landscape level, which is a standard approach to most management agencies. So broadly speaking, forest carbon models can fall into two broad categories. First, we have empirical models, which is more of your statistical modeling approach. And so if we look at the first set of images on the screen here, some colleagues of mine are setting up a fixed radial plot in a forested ecosystem where we can take a variety of different forest measurements such as DBH. So we can see the plot there on the right is just a general plot of associating DBH versus biomass. And so we're in this example, we're pretty much just fitting a basic statistical model to understand that relationship. On the other side, we can also estimate carbon through photosynthetic processes. And these are more commonly known as process-based models. And so if we look at the next set of images, oftentimes these types of models, while they can tell us similar things, are a lot more complex in a lot of different ways. So you can see another colleague of mine, Scott Stark, using a LICOR measure to assess gas exchange at the leaf level in a tree outside of Manaus, Brazil. And then next to that, we can see what's called an eddy covariance flux tower. So this is how we can scale up this idea of like photosynthesis or productivity across the landscape. And then these can feed into these larger models that sometimes are referred to as dynamic vegetation models, dynamic global vegetation models. And these models act a lot differently than a lot of statistical models do, but oftentimes the results can be used for similar things. And then kind of generally when we think about these models, most models don't actually fall into either one of these two categories and are actually a hybrid of both. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about how oftentimes models aren't purely empirical or process-based. So if we move the slide along, there are oftentimes a variety of benefits when talking about hybrid models. When it comes to process-based models, oftentimes these models can be poorly constrained, and using empirical data can add strength to those parameters. On the inverse side of that, process-based models give us a lot of advantages in simulation. Not that we can't do predictive models with empirical data, but when it comes to complex carbon dynamics, oftentimes projections can be more accurate when we're simulating a more process-based framework. And then generally, as opposed to a purely process-based model that takes a lot of time, effort, to collect data and parameterize a model, oftentimes hybrid models use data that's way more accessible and data that any operational scale forester would use. So thinking forest plots, DBH measurements, stem counts, volume measurements, and other common measurements that we use to characterize forest landscapes. So there also are challenges to both of these approaches as well as hybrid models. So just generally, modeling forest dynamics is a really complex process. And so if you look at the image on the left there, this is kind of thinking about full scale, where does carbon go? So we have the interaction of the atmosphere and vegetation. As biomass moves through systems, biomass can either increase, it can die, it can decrease, go to below ground pools. And there's also the anthropogenic side of that as well. And so both modeling approaches, hybrid, process-based, empirical, trying to capture forest dynamics can be challenging, but we have ways to approach that. Secondly, both empirical models and process-based models can also be poorly constrained. Obviously, we have methods to approach this. But as an example, a lot of process-based models use a system of equations to model over time things like turnover parameters, but we know these are affected by things as like climate, soil characters matter here. And so combining these two things can allow us to more accurately model these, but there's still challenges that arise from this. And then lastly, linking these types of models to both harvested wood product models as well as finance models remains challenging. Generally, hybrid simulations bode well for this, where a purely process-based model, while they can be linked, remains quite difficult. So if we move to the next slide, I'm going to introduce the tool that we have been using for this. So this is the CBM CSF3. So this is the carbon budget model of the Canadian forest sector. So this is a hybrid model that combines strengths of both empirical and process-based modeling approaches. This model is Tier 3 IPCC compliant. So what I mean by that, there are two methods in Tier 3 IPCC compliance, one being multiple inventory change over time. So if you had a forest stand and across subsequent years, you came back and re-inventoried, you could take from, for example, time 2, your measurements, subtract time 1, and that could be growth over time. But as you can think, that is challenging. It could cost a lot of money. So another Tier 3 method is the one inventory plus change. So this is a less data intensive approach where you need to start with an initial forest inventory and then you simulate dynamics going forward. So how does the CBM kind of do that? So the CBM tracks 10 biomass pools as well as 11 dead organic matter pools. And this allows for seamless and easy aggregation into our 5 main IPCC carbon pools, which relates to, could be national level reporting. You can see the image on the left there of the good practice guidance. So this model follows methodologies laid out in that document. Some other things about the CBM is spatially referenced. There is a companion model that's open source called the GCBM that is a spatially explicit model. But as we go through this presentation, I'll discuss a little bit why sometimes when we think about forest carbon and carbon modeling at the landscape level, spatially explicit models don't always lend a lot of credence to our projections into the future. And then lastly, kind of one of the most important things to this model is the ease of integrating a variety of data sets into this model. So if we go to the next slide, so as a framework, how does the CBM actually function? And so as a user using the CBM, a user is going to provide a detailed forest inventory, empirically derived volume age curves into the model. And then within the model, there's already default values for litter fall and decomposition rates, as well as a variety of allometric equations to convert our forest volume to a biomass conversion. And we advance the slide. Users are also able to input various forest disturbance and representations of that forest disturbance as examples. Harvest or management activities could be inputted, natural disturbances, everything from abiotic to biotic disturbances, as well as land use change. So if we move to the next slide, I'll go a little bit more in depth into our data inputs and model structure. So kind of thinking about our data inputs. And so when we say a detailed forest inventory, what does that mean? So the image on the left is an example of a forest inventory derived from FIA data for the state of Maryland. So we need some age-based description of our forest, and then that inventory needs to be split up by forest characteristics that we call classifiers. Oftentimes classifiers are ways to denote parts of our forest. These could be spatial units, like a county, for example. These could be forest types. Ownership classifications, as well as site productivity, are all common classifiers to be used. Other data inputs include empirically derived growth yield relationships, which I'll go into a little bit more later, as well as representation of disturbances. So oftentimes the 3 common ones are what I've already mentioned. So harvest management activities, natural disturbances, and land use change, which the second image here is an example using Matt Hansen's Global Forest Watch data set showing in central Pennsylvania afforestation and deforestation rates across the past 2 decades. And there is a big key here on the flexibility of the data inputs. And so all of these things feed into our model structure, which is primarily built off of this volume to biomass conversion. So while there are default values provided within the model, users are able to take similar measurements and apply their own conversions as well, knowing that taking like a generalized allometric model, we can take tree volume, convert that to biomass, understanding that biomass is highly correlated with carbon in woody materials. And then the last part of this model structure is this process-based part, where we're simulating essentially turnover root parameters. And these parameters, similar to all process-based models, are climate and soil dependent, as opposed to a purely process-based model. These are constant within our model. So a user will input like average temperature as an example, as well as soil characteristics that will then dictate your turnover rates, where in a purely process-based model, those things could be constant over, or not constant, those things can be dynamic over time, and that would then affect these rates over time. So we move on to the next slide. I'm going to talk a lot about what we deem the Forest Inventory Analysis Database. So this is where we derive a lot of our estimates. So FIA, as it's more commonly known, is a national system for monitoring forest and forest change. First implemented as early as the 1930s with a variety of periodic inventories across states, has since been revised as of 1999 to streamline methods and designs, where now, as opposed to a variety of plot sizes, different intensities of sampling, we now have a spatially robust systematic sample where essentially we take a cluster of 4 subplots, which you can see here, across what we call a hexagonal window. So if we look at the next image, we place hexagons across the landscape where each hexagon represents 6,000 acres. We place one of these clustered plots into these subplots. And then every 5 years, all of these subplots are measured. So if you can think about, if this is a landscape that we're viewing right here, green is forest, tan is non-forest. So if this is our study area within like the sampling design, 1/5 of these would be measured every year for 5 years to have one complete survey window across that 5-year period. So some strengths of using the FIA program is this is one of the largest ecological data sets by both spatial and temporal extent. And the flexibility inherent to the FIA inventory system creates unprecedented opportunities to assess forest change across space and time. And that kind of brings me next to emerging applications. And so historically, the FIA system has been difficult for people to access. There are great tools online provided by the Forest Service. But as far as like a data analyst, sometimes it's been difficult to process a lot of the results. So some emerging applications are tools like RFAA, for example, which is a data package within the R coding environment that allows a lot of ease in use. And then on top of that, there has been large advances in both small area estimation and temporal queries within the FIA database going forward. And I would only expect that to continue. And thinking about, as we get more data within the FIA database, we'll have strong understandings and applications for not just carbon cycling, but forest growth, forest health, and remote sensing, and as well as improvements to both our carbon and biomass estimation in both space and time. So we move to the next slide. So how did we actually derive our estimates using FIA data? And so we did a variety of different methods. So for some of our data inputs, such as like our inventory, as well as like forest removals, we used Bechtold and Patterson, which is methodologies published along with the FIA database to estimate a variety of age-dependent indicators within the forest. So if we bring up the first image here, so here's an example where we have stand age on the x-axis, we have merchantable volume on our y-axis. Within our study area of Maryland and Pennsylvania, each panel on this graph is a different forest type group. So we can, and each dot is a representation of a plot. So we can take these plots and use these methodologies to estimate at the population level, for example, like annual harvest removals or annual change in growth. And then we can also take those plots and estimate things like growth yield. And so if you can see, like on the image on the left there, those lines on those plots is just a generalized additive model. But then we can also take those plots and apply like a fancier growth function. So on the right here, we have a higher processed version of a growth yield relationship. So same thing, we have stand age on the x-axis, we have cubic meters of merchantable volume per hectare on the y-axis, and then each color is representative of a forest type group. And so taking these plot level estimates, we were able to then apply those within our own growth model, essentially yield over. So if we go to the next slide, so thinking about how do all these things integrate, how do we streamline the process of incorporating a variety of empirical data estimates, everything from, as I just mentioned, forest inventory data to remotely sensed metrics and disturbance frequency intensity data. So on the image on the left here within that blue box, these are all data in the study area that we'll be talking about to understand land use change. That's only one example. Same thing, we used a variety of both survey and spatially explicit data to estimate both natural disturbances, both abiotic and biotic. So things like defoliating events, insect disease outbreaks, or even abiotic disturbances such as wind disturbance. And so this idea that we can take disparate data sets that have different spatial and temporal resolution and put them into one modeling framework is advantageous. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we also have our customizable volume to biomass conversions. So taking information from our forest inventory, and we can apply that to a generalized allometric equation already built into the model and derive our own estimates if default parameters aren't suitable for the project that we're working on. And so within that red box, we actually have those litter fall and decomposition parameters, as well as feeding into the actual model, which uses process-based applications to actually simulate into the future or simulate previous carbon dynamics. And then all of that feeds into what we're calling this hybrid modeling approach, where we get simulation-based results. And then as far as like the post-processing side of our results, we've been lucky to work very closely with the team that has developed this in the Canadian Forest Service. And while there is like a graphical user interface for the model, we did ours through a Python-based API. And for data people, the results database that comes out is very easily processed in a variety of languages. You could use Python, you could use R, or like Tableau, for example, are all ease in that post-processing of our results. And then lastly, the CBM modeling framework that we use does have a linkage between both finance and harvested wood product models. So there's an associated harvested wood product model that we have used as a subsequent analysis that we'll also talk about, and looking at not just what we're doing within the forest ecosystem, but once that carbon is removed from the system, what happens to that and how do we account for that in our future simulations.
All right, thanks, Chad. I will take over from here and we'll switch gears a little bit, building on all of the great work that Chad just outlined, the challenges with modeling forest carbon, especially at the landscape scale, a lot of the data work that we did using this model in the US, and really start to pull us into the reason that we did all of this modeling work and start to talk about the second part of this, which is the way that we use this as a tool for statewide planning and action. So a lot of this really comes into play in a suite of modeling projects that we have to examine the carbon impacts of forest management practices. And we're working with partners in 7 different states really at the state agency, forestry agency or DNR level. So we're working with the mid-Atlantic states of Maryland and Pennsylvania. We are working with the lake states of Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and then we are also working with the states of Oregon and California. And the we, in this sense, is a great collaborative team of experts led by myself at American Forests. We have some collaborators from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the U.S. Forest Service. As Chad mentioned, we do have the Canadian Forest Service team advising us since we're using their model in the US, which is kind of novel application. And then of course we have Chad, Kylie, and others at Michigan State working on this team as well. And so the objectives of all of these modeling projects are essentially to understand the carbon impacts of different forest management and wood utilization scenarios. So we're using the CBM to help us understand not only the carbon impacts in the forested ecosystem itself, but also the links to where that carbon goes in wood products once the trees come out of the forest, where those products go in the economy and the substitution benefits we get from that, and then looking at the economic benefits and trade-offs of each of those scenarios. So we're taking this real whole sector approach so we can think about all of the parts of forest and the forest sector that might contribute to some climate mitigation potential for each of our states. So by doing this, we can understand the climate mitigation potential of those individual scenarios or practices, as well as portfolios of those different practices across the landscape, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the future. We're doing this really for two big reasons. One is to be able to integrate carbon into forest management and planning at the state level. We can think about integrating this information into something like a state forest action plan, where a state agency would like to set forth goals for their forests 10 years into the future. They'd like to understand how carbon sits in there, just like any other management goal of timber production, water quality, wildlife habitat, recreation. We want to provide information so that carbon can be considered kind of on equal footing there, not as the primary goal, but as one of many to manage for. But then by providing information about this whole sector of forests and forest products, we can better integrate forests as natural climate solutions into state climate planning as well. Something that's all the rage with all of the impacts of climate change, all these IPCC reports that keep coming out talking about how we really need to lean on the land sink, the national and working land sector as much as we can. And so really when we think about natural climate solutions, we have a better sense of how much carbon we might get from tree planting or how much carbon we might get from protecting trees. But there's this broad range of forest management practices these practices are in use across the landscape for a lot of different goals, and we don't have a good sense of how those play out for carbon. So by providing that information, then we have a better way to put forests into a greenhouse gas inventory or other climate plans right next to other sectors of the economy, like the electric sector or transportation sector, and really give them their due in state climate planning. So all of this really comes down to a giant scenario comparison project. We essentially use all of the data that Chad described on harvest and management activities, on natural disturbances and land use change. We pull together historical information and then project that forward under a business as usual scenario, assuming if things continue this way, this is how carbon might play out across the landscape in the future. We run that first through the CBM CFS3, the model that Chad had mentioned, which is our landscape scale ecosystem model. And then any wood products that are slated to come out of the forest are fed into an associated custom built harvested wood products model, also using a framework developed by the Canadian Forest Service. And custom built meaning that we are tracking the certain products and product types that are actually produced in each state rather than using a kind of catch-all set of products for each state. So once we have that business as usual projected forward, then we construct our different scenarios by changing something in the business as usual. So we can look at changes in forest management or changes in wood utilization, and it gives us this long list of potential scenarios that we've modeled. So we do have some scenarios looking at extending rotations in our states. We have scenarios looking at the impacts of controlling deer browse and promoting natural regeneration. The controlling deer browse is especially important for the mid-Atlantic states, for Maryland and Pennsylvania, where deer just like to go through and eat everything, especially young little saplings and seedlings. And then we have some issues with the age class structure of the forest, where we have aging forests and not much of a kind of natural regeneration, a younger cohort coming back in. And we can all think intuitively from the kind of forest sustainability or forest longevity standpoint, but that's not the greatest situation. So it's a big management concern for the states in which that's happening. We also have scenarios that are looking at optimizing stocking levels, which for the mid-Atlantic states really looks like restocking, again, trying to address some of these natural regeneration or age class distribution issues. But optimizing stocking levels for California actually could look like reducing stocking densities across the landscape. There are a lot of forests that are currently at a higher density than their historical conditions or than kind of optimal conditions for reducing fire risks. And so those optimizing stocking levels can go either way depending on your management objectives for your forest. We also have practices like timber stand improvements and resilience or restoration treatments, which always end up being a combination of thinning and prescribed burning, but they play out differently at different intensities or kind of return intervals, depending on the management objectives that you may have. We do have some practices looking at those other types of forest climate solutions as well. We have afforestation and silvopasture. We have some reducing high grading or diameter limit cuts and reducing deforestation. And then we do have some scenarios looking at no harvest activities or reductions of harvest activities across the landscape. That's all kind of on the forest management and ecosystem side. And then for wood utilization, we have some scenarios looking at creating more mass timber or long-lived wood products, either from current levels of harvest or from additional harvest. And then looking at using woody biomass for energy or transportation fuels, again, either from kind of current harvest levels or especially for the woody biomass scenarios, we're looking at maybe using fuel reduction treatment materials as feedstocks for these different kind of wood utilization scenarios. So you can imagine this big exhaustive list, this broad range of forest management scenarios. We have a lot of really interesting uses for all of this. We can think about how each of these play out in isolation across the landscape or how they behave in a portfolio. And that leads us to thinking about a lot of the different model outputs and results that we get from this big of a project. So though what we're doing is modeling the carbon impacts of all of this, as we've described, there's a lot of work that goes into pulling together all of that data, making sure that it makes sense, combining disparate data sources, as Chad had mentioned. So one of the useful outputs actually that we've heard from state partners is that we are compiling a list of the current practices on the landscape for all ownerships across our states, which is actually kind of a unique data set. A lot of times it's in different places. If you want to know about what the Forest Service is doing, you go to the FACTS database. If you want to know about what's happening on state lands, you go to a state database or state forest management plans. If you want to know what's happening on private lands, good luck. It's kind of hard to find that information, and sometimes for good reason. But for our business as usual scenario here, we actually do have to pull together all of that information. So seeing that all in one place and providing that to our state partners is a really useful tool that they can use in statewide planning, even if they're not looking at the carbon impacts of all the practices that we're modeling. We also, as Chad mentioned, put a lot of work into developing yield curves from FIA data for all the forest types and age classes that we find in our landscape. And that can be useful from the forest management planning perspective to think about which forest types grow more quickly, which forest types have a kind of longer growth curve, or if there are some that have slower accumulation rates at different ages. And then also thinking about how these yield curves change with different management practices or different climate conditions, as we would expect they will. So thinking about at the kind of stand in the landscape level, how forest growth plays out now and could change in the future, also a useful tool for planning actions. I've mentioned this business as usual scenario, which we project forward as kind of our baseline, if you will. So understanding the projected trends under that scenario is also really useful. You can understand whether your forests in your state will continue to be a carbon sink, as we hope they will, whether you're at risk of becoming a net carbon source, and that can inform a lot of different policy objectives or management objectives across the state and the landscape. And then of course, the crux of it is this comparison of scenario performance or climate mitigation potential, comparing various kind of carbon metrics for each scenario. In addition though, for some of our states, we've also done some auxiliary work on looking at statewide restoration and reforestation needs. And these are kind of extra geospatial models that our team ends up building to map the areas across the state, like California, that need some restoration work to reduce wildfire risk, or will need reforestation because natural regeneration is likely to fail in an area post-fire. And so these assessments give us acreage targets and things to turn into modeling scenarios, but assessments like those are also really useful planning tools for our states, even without the carbon information associated with them. And then, as I mentioned, somewhat when talking about the yield curves, we also are always going to assess the projected future climate impacts on these forests, because you can't really think about planning any forest management into the future without acknowledging that climate change is here, it's coming, it's going to continue to affect forests either through their growth, through their mortality, through the rates of natural disturbances and other kind of levers there. So all of these different tools kind of combine to give us the scenario outputs that we'll talk through in a second. And you can imagine that there are a lot of potential policy targets or actions that can come out of any one of these things. So we can think about using some scenarios to help set some acreage targets for meeting carbon goals. We can set up scenarios to test different acreages to meet a certain amount of carbon, or just say, if we really went for it, if we went for the maximum potential acreage for a certain practice, what would the carbon impact of that be? We can also think about ranking certain practices as more or less effective for meeting certain forest and climate goals. And I'll talk through that a little bit more in a second, but this kind of, the ranking of practices depends a lot on the objectives and would lead you to some very different policy targets or actions depending on your goals for forests and carbon across the state. We're also really trying to encourage all of our state partners to take the carbon results, but also use that to think about the current state capacity and funding and programs to incentivize any of these practices that they think are really promising across the landscape. For example, if we want to go big on reforestation, if we want to plant a lot of trees, do we have the nursery capacity for that? Where are the seedlings going to come from? Do we have the planting crews? Do we have the money? All of these things are really critically important to think about, so that we're not making forest and climate goals in isolation, but we're really making sure that the supporting infrastructure is there to help us out as well. So with all of that as a kind of general outline, I'm going to walk through the way that some of these outputs have come out for our project in the mid-Atlantic states in Maryland and Pennsylvania, just to give you a sense of how this can be used in a more detailed, concrete context. So first off, that kind of list of current practices that I mentioned, this is something that we have to pull together for our business as usual scenario for each of our states. And it is something that, as Chad mentioned, comes from a lot of disparate data sources. So we derive some of this from FIA data, from RPA and TPO reports on the wood product side of things, from NLCD, from MTBS, from the insects and disease surveys, from various literature, and then state level data. We're pulling together as much information as we can to try to get to tables like this one. So we're pulling together all the information on land use change trends, natural disturbance trends, and forest management trends. This last one, the forest management trends, especially kind of attribution to different practices, does take a lot of work. We can pull total carbon removal information from FIA, but there's no attribution in there as to whether said carbon is removed from a clear cut or a thinning or something in between. And so we did a lot of work working with our state partners in Maryland and Pennsylvania, looking at the state data, considering typical silviculture for the forest types and the ages across the landscape, and really apportioning carbon removals into different practices like clear cuts or shelter woods based on what we could find out about the landscape. So this is a way to kind of back ourselves into a sense of typical silviculture or typical management across the state, which is really useful information that hasn't really been presented to our state partners before. Now that's all on the ecosystem side of things. We have a table that looks a lot like this for the wood products. But one interesting thing to think about is this little graph on the left, which shows the proportion of harvested wood that's distributed into various product categories in Maryland. So again, just getting a sense of when your wood is harvested, where is it going, what is it being used for? And you can see for Maryland that in both softwood and hardwood, we get a lot of material going into pulpwood, either from green harvest or from mill residues. You get more hardwood going into saw logs than softwood. You have a lot of, or I shouldn't say a lot, a little bit of bioenergy from mill residues and other kind of uses. This graph for California, for example, looks wildly different. There's really not much of a pulp and paper industry, so the pulpwood portions are very small. There's a lot more bioenergy use in the state. And so just getting a sense of not only what's happening across the landscape, but when trees are removed, where they're going, is really useful information. So once we've pulled all of that together, this business as usual we can start thinking about the modeling, both the business as usual and the other scenarios that we've talked about. And this look at projections here, what you're seeing are kind of cumulative annual emissions or kind of cumulative carbon amounts for the ecosystem and harvested wood products combined for our modeling period from 2020 to 2100. This is from the kind of atmospheric perspective. So negative numbers in these graphs represent additional carbon being sequestered. That's the net carbon sink. That's what we want. So negative numbers are good in this case. And so these projections can show us whether forests will stay a net carbon sink, stay in those negative numbers, or become a net carbon source over time. And then we can look at how those different scenarios behave relative to each other and relative to the business as usual, and think about how those practices can then alter the trajectory of forests in each state. So for Maryland and Pennsylvania, it's a particularly interesting example where Maryland's forests, the graph on the left, are projected to remain a net carbon sink in our business as usual by the end of the century. And actually in every single scenario, they will remain a net carbon sink, but some scenarios have less of a carbon sink than others. So there's still a lot of ways to think about which scenarios can either improve that trend or kind of dampen it a little bit. For Pennsylvania, we're showing something a little bit different, where forests and wood products are projected to become a net carbon source in the business as usual by 2100. And that plays out in a lot of the different scenarios. But one thing that I draw your attention to is this portfolio scenario, which I drew a little green box around down there on the right. It is the scenario that's kind of dark green with big round dots on it. That scenario represents a combination of all the different things you could do across the landscape together. All the other scenarios that we look at, the way we tend to model our scenarios is we do them in isolation. If we have an extended rotation scenario, we are just extending the rotations that we want to, and everything else in the business as usual stays the same. But that's not really how policy action would go. If the state of Pennsylvania is really going to go in on forests as a climate solution, they're going to be looking at multiple different scenarios or multiple practices at the same time. So this portfolio scenario is our representation of putting together a real concerted effort in all the different things you could do across the landscape. And so notably, that one actually does completely reverse the trend and allow Pennsylvania's forests to stay a net carbon sink over time. So the message here is really interesting that though forests don't have a great trend under current conditions in the future, there are a lot of things that we can do to change that. And a lot of that comes down to some concern about high grading and other practices that are not great for long-term forest health and resilience or vigor. And then a lot of concerns about age class distributions due to deer browse and other kind of issues that I've mentioned before, where we're just catching the state in a weird spot where there are a lot of aging forests and not much of a younger cohort coming in. But there are definitely things that we can do about that. And so thinking about not only these trends, but starting to compare the scenarios and kind of rank them relative to each other, we can get into a table like this. This has a lot of information, and I'm not going to go into all the details in here, but really just to give you a sense of the way that we can use some of these results to start identifying practices that are effective at meeting our different carbon goals. So this table is ranking all of our different scenarios by their relative performance, kind of relative rankings. These rankings differ a lot, whether you're looking at carbon stocks per acre or carbon fluxes per acre, which makes sense. If you are prioritizing carbon stocks, you want scenarios that will give you more and more carbon accumulating on the landscape and staying there. If you're prioritizing carbon fluxes, then you want things that will continue to pull more and more carbon out of the atmosphere as quickly as possible. And both are really important strategies for fighting climate change, but they can lead you to some very different practices across the landscape if you think about this. So the color coding for these here, for Maryland on the left and Pennsylvania on the right, is really based on the rank of those scenarios in terms of accumulating carbon stocks. And then we've just reshuffled them for how well they perform in maximizing or optimizing carbon fluxes per acre. So you can understand that when you're looking at those two different objectives, it will lead you to prioritizing different practices across the landscape. And it's also really important to think about the timeline for all of this. There's a lot of focus on action by 2030, but some of these practices, especially the ones dealing with natural regeneration, looking at controlling deer browse or restocking, some of those take a little bit longer to actually show their carbon impacts, just because trees take a little while to grow. Forests take a little while to show the impacts of some of the management practices that we implement. And so really comparing those different timelines and these different objectives is really important in comparing these scenarios and identifying the kind of most promising practices for each state. So thinking about the previous graphs and then this table leads us to something like this, a kind of list of opportunities and takeaways for mid-Atlantic forests. So what we recommend or what we are seeing based on our data is that it's really important for both states to prioritize forest health and structure and rebalancing that age class distribution, that a lot of the potentially troubling trajectories are based on that. So if there's a focus on protecting natural regeneration, that can do a lot to set things on the right track. There's also some ideas about scaling up ambition for tree planting. The protecting natural regeneration is really focused on maintaining the carbon sink as it is, but to scale up or kind of increase the size of the carbon sink, there are a lot of opportunities for tree planting. And not that we can plant our way out of a climate crisis, but there are a lot of places that we can plant trees, including through silvopasture. And not surprisingly, the greater ambition, the greater number of acres, or the longer that you plant trees for, the larger carbon impact you tend to see across the landscape. But silvopasture is a particularly interesting opportunity or scenario for both states because it is the kind of integration of low density trees intentionally into pasture land. It keeps the land as pasture and actually is beneficial for the livestock that are there. They benefit from the shade, they benefit from the additional forage from those trees. And then landowners have all of a sudden an additional revenue stream. Either they can plant fruit trees or timber producing species. And the fact that it doesn't take land out of current pasture use means that there are millions of acres of pasture land available in these states and throughout the country where this is a good potential option. But adoption is pretty limited now. There are understandably a lot of concerns from landowners who haven't really seen it demonstrated in a really scaled way yet. And so one thing that both states could think about is based on the carbon potential from this practice, kind of trying to think about how to scale that up across the landscape. Also, of course, incentivizing some more sustainable management practices on private lands, again, would help address some of the kind of forest health and structure and regeneration issues. And especially for the mid-Atlantic states, which are majority private lands, that becomes a really important component of making sure that forests continue to be as strong of a net sink as they can. And then we have run a couple different scenarios looking at the potential impacts of climate change. I didn't mention them much in this presentation, but anything that our states can do, especially to prepare for more pest and disease impacts across the landscape, will be really beneficial. So I realize we're coming up on our Q&A time. I want to give us one last slide just to think about the trajectory of going from the data, thinking about different scenarios, thinking about the business as usual, comparing our different scenarios, leading us to these opportunities, and then thinking about ways that we can catalyze action on these opportunities through different policy applications. So this is not an exhaustive list of all the opportunities in these states. It's just a list of some of the newest things that are happening, which is an exciting indication that there's a lot of momentum and a lot of focus on this right now. So one of the newest ones is the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022, which was passed in Maryland about a month ago. And it sets forth a 2045 net zero economy-wide goal for the state. And so this is the first time that there's been an economy-wide goal for the state. They will be looking a lot at the land sink, at forests to be able to contribute as a really strong carbon sink to get the state to net zero. And so you can imagine that if we have this whole sector analysis of the potential for forest carbon and wood products and substitution benefits, that's really useful information to plug into comparisons against other whole sectors in this net zero goal. There are also opportunities to leverage new conservation finance made available through the Conservation Finance Act of 2022 to support some of the tree planting goals in the state through the Tree Solutions Now Act of 2021. Also opportunities to think about RGGI and other carbon markets. Both Maryland and Pennsylvania are RGGI members. And you can imagine that there are also some opportunities for voluntary carbon markets in both states. It's possible that as we continue understanding the carbon impacts of even more of these management practices, that we could expand the list of practices for a typical IFM project in a carbon market, for example. The Family Forest Carbon Program has started to do that. I think we can continue that work and continue to help landowners engage in carbon markets with the practices that they already may want to enact on their lands. And then thinking about Pennsylvania, there's a lot of action going on in Pennsylvania, really kind of at the state planning level at the moment. So Pennsylvania does have a climate change advisory committee, which is responsible for advising the state on how to anticipate and deal with climate change. The Climate Change Advisory Committee actually put out, or was responsible for kind of pulling together this climate action plan for the state last year. There's a forest action plan in Pennsylvania as well. And our state partners have been involved in both plans, and you can imagine in these action plans that we can identify the forest practices that might be useful or kind of prioritized across the landscape, and then thinking about how we can leverage forests in climate action as well. So I want to thank you all for your time and your attention, and turn it over to Kylie for the last few minutes of this for a Q&A session, but also offer to, you can reach out to both Chad and I via email if you have additional questions or would like to know more about our work.
All right, thank you very much, Chad and Kendall. I anticipate people may be reaching out to you because we have way too many questions to address in the time remaining. Normally I can like sneak in my own of interest questions, but nay, not this time. Okay, so let's, to start, some sort of process-based questions or for your modeling. Is there an advantage or reason the CBM was chosen? Were other frameworks, carbon modeling frameworks entertained? US regional variants in FVS, for instance. Thinking, another related question was, other states were looking to do this. Is the CBM the one, or is this the most appropriate tool, or how did you come to your decision there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll start, and then Chad, if you have anything else to add, you can jump in. So a lot of this is building on some work that was done on smaller scales in the US to use the CBM for various states, Pennsylvania being one of them. And the CBM is something that our state partners were really interested in using, but something that we also wanted to adopt because it is well suited for that landscape scale analysis. It does really well at looking at multiple states or regions and thinking about how trends play out across an entire landscape. FES is really great at thinking about tree dynamics or stand level dynamics. And I think there's a really great potential for integration there where we could look at the impacts of some practices in FES and then use the CBM with its landscape engine to model that out across a larger landscape. But because all of the work that we're doing is focused on multi-state regions, we really need a model that can handle that kind of larger spatial scale.
Great, thank you. Now, a similar or vein of question, why the Mid-Atlantic region as a focus area? There's note that in terms of carbon, Pacific Northwest or the Southeast might be a great potential for carbon storage, and yeah, can you shed thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mentioned when I first started talking that we are really partnering with natural resource agencies in states where we're working. And so this is really wanting to make sure that we're doing research with state partners who are actively interested in the results and the modeling process. So American Forest was approached by partners in Maryland and Pennsylvania to help them run this model to kind of now. And so that's what states in the past. And both states have a pretty active forestry sector. They may not be considered the same kind of carbon powerhouses as the Southeast or the Pacific Northwest, but there's some really important issues that both states are working through. And ultimately, we'd love to run this any state or region that's interested. So we had to start somewhere, and we're building out to other regions of the country as we go.
And then regarding the scenarios you selected, so you mentioned that so it's rare that these activities would be selected in isolation, right? This portfolio approach. Would it be useful, do you think, to have more portfolio scenarios run at different levels of activity with the different sub scenarios, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, Chad, if you want to jump in, please feel free to jump in here. I don't need to be the only one talking. I'll just, the short answer is that we are going to do something like that for subsequent projects. What I presented was for the first project you did with Maryland and Pennsylvania. We've learned a lot from that process. We developed things that worked for our state partners there, but what worked for them may not meet the same goals for Oregon or for California. So we are definitely looking at constructing more scenarios that maybe represent, or more portfolios that represent kind of different levels of policy action or investment in a way. You could think about different scales of restoration activities, one that's kind of based on current capacity, one that's based on, I don't know, maybe doubling current capacity, one that's based on, let's treat all the potential acres that need restoration in X number of different levels of action, different levels of those management practices, but also can give you a different sense of the supporting infrastructure and the different capacity and funding needs that you need as well. So that's definitely a refinement to our process that we're anticipating bringing in the future.
So now some couple of clarification questions. Do the modeling results that you show for Maryland and Pennsylvania include substitution effects? For example, does the no harvest scenario include emissions from substitution?
Yes. Sorry, you froze for a second, Kylie. I wasn't sure if it was. Yes, they do. The graphs that I showed do include some substitution numbers. And we have other graphs that will be in the reports and things that we put out. We can always have a more detailed conversation about this offline. But we do, in addition to the carbon contained in wood products, we do look at substitution benefits. And we also look at potential leakage in scenarios where harvesting in an alternative scenario is less than what you would have had in the business as usual. So we are trying to look at the kind of broader scope of where those wood products go and how management actions affect their availability in the ecosystem or in the economy.
Okay, maybe our last or second to last question here, if we can fit it in. How confident are we in when stand age forest carbon begins to decline? Right, there's noted some uncertainties there, especially around soil carbon accumulation. How confident are you? How confident is the science? You know, is there great uncertainty there in the results accordingly?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so when we're looking at it within the framework that we chose, we're existing solely in carbon. And so like, as I showed those like growth yield curves, they didn't have a decline. So there is contention within the literature around what happens into like a late stage of like of stand dynamics, like maturation. But generally we see that from the carbon standpoint, at some point in older stands that reach like later stages, mortality and productivity basically even out. So as like a long-term average, from a carbon standpoint, we don't see a decline unless there is some sort of other stand replacing event, disturbance, pest or pathogen move in. But for example, like aspen's an early successional stage, you would decrease in aspen over time, but you would have other hardwood species moving in. So from a carbon perspective, you're not getting an absolute drop in like your overall volume or like amount. And then talking about uncertainty and also soil carbon. So one thing we did to account for some of these things, so we actually started our simulation 13 years prior to when we started our projection. And so part of that was to more properly constrain our soil carbon. So we use the Monte Carlo method, and in our team, we call it the rollback method. So essentially we start with our 2020 forest inventory, roll back that inventory. So where we were in 2007 using actual measurements from those years, and then started our simulation there. We did do some ground truthing across that decade to look at like how did productivity function in our model versus other people's estimates. And then kind of last thing on uncertainty. So that was one thing that we did. But within the approach that we chose, uncertainty can arise in a variety of different places. So one thing is like the uncertainty inherent to the model structure. And so there are methods to run some sort of a sensitivity analysis to that, as well as looking at uncertainty related to our data inputs. And that is something that we're actually working on. So we're collaborating with also with the Canadian Forest Service to do a secondary analysis on a subset of our data in the study area to both assess how does uncertainty look within the model structure in that mid-Atlantic region, as well as what is the uncertainty around our data inputs, understanding that we took these long-term average means, but we did apply like a different methodology, like we derived lots of different harvest regimes, taking random draws from our distribution. What would that mean for our data outputs as well?
Awesome, thank you for that, Chad. I think you just inadvertently answered 3 of the questions that I had. So well done with your efficiency. And fortunately so, because we unfortunately are out of time here. So thank you so much to Chad and Kendall and to all the participants here who stuck around, and really appreciate it. And apologies if I wasn't able to get to your question. Do reach out to Chad and Kendall. Sounds like they're amenable to that. So send your questions their way. And I hope to have them, that they will be answered. And just to reiterate again, the webinar slides and a recording will be up within the week or so on the website. So you can watch again at your leisure and so forth. And hope all have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, y'all.